Okay, we're going to be identifying different numbers. Let's start with an easy one, and we're going to be associating them with their groups. Okay, let's start with an easy one. Pi. What group does pi belong to? Well, we can say here pi belongs to the irrational numbers because it's a repeating forever. No, it's a non-repeating forever number that can't be represented by a fraction. Okay, well, what about 3 over 4? Well, 3 over 4 is not a whole number, so because it's positive, but it's represented as 0.5, which is not a whole number. So it's not a whole number. It's not a natural number. It's not an integer because integers can't be parts like this. But it is a fraction. It's a number represented by fraction, so it's a rational number. What about -2? -2 can be represented by a fraction as -4 or over 2, which would be equal to -2. 4 divided by 2 is 2, and then we have the negative sign in front. So it's a rational number because it would be represented by a fraction, but it's also a whole negative number, so it's an integer. So -2 is an integer. What about -13? Well, -13 can also be represented by a fraction. I'm not going to write it out right here, but you can represent it by a fraction. And so that would make it a rational number, but it's also negative, and it's a whole, so it's an integer. I'm using whole as to say that it's not a mixed number. So this is an integer. It's not a rational, it's not a whole, it's not a natural, it's just an integer. Okay, what about 33? 33 can also be represented as a fraction, because if I were to multiply 33 times 2, and that would be 66, then 66 over 2 is equal to 33. So that's a fraction of 33. So it's a rational number. It's not negative. But it's not negative, but it's positive, and integers include the positive ones. So 33 is also an integer, but it's also not negative, and whole numbers are all the positive ones, so it's also a whole number. So it's a rational number because it can be represented by a fraction. It's also an integer because integer includes both negative and positive, and it's also whole because whole just includes positive. And what about 4? Well, 4 can be represented by a fraction, so it's a rational. Integer, it's also an integer because integers include the negative and positive. This is positive. Whole numbers, it's a whole number because whole numbers just includes positive. It's a natural number because it's a positive number, but also not 0. So it's a natural number. And what about square root of 2? Well, that's an irrational number because I had to write it as square root of 2. I couldn't write it as a fraction. I couldn't write it as another number. So it's an irrational number because it can't be represented by a fraction. Okay, stay in school.